Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom. Give our honor, our praises, and glory to Yahweh, Ba'ashem, Yahushai, Ba'ashem, Rakakwadash, double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone, teachings his truth and salutations to the sincere Akio and Aqua listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's topic, I wanted to read through this quick article that I found on what's it called? Politico.eu, basically describing the recent events. So the article is a bit long, so I'm just going to be kind of hitting some key points here. So the title here, it says Trump's Venezuela grabs plies paying on Keir Starmer. So this is basically so essentially it's the perception of how the British Prime Minister has seen the recent actions and events that have occurred between the US and Venezuela, right? So this is his way in, and I want to read a little bit of this, and I sincerely hope and pray that this lesson, truly is edifying, right? So here it says Keir Starmer. So this is the current prime minister of Britain, and it says is used to biting his tongue when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. But Donald Trump's latest adventure is particularly awkward for the British prime minister. It says here that Starmer is a former human rights lawyer who has described international law as his lodestar. But in power, he has strived desperately to keep Trump on his side as the whole host of issues even when the U.S. action appears to fly in the face of Starmer's cherished legal norms. So here it says, continuing on, it's got an embattled labor leader facing the fresh charges of timidity at this time, and his political rivals on the left and the right are free to paint in primary colors. His delicate balancing act on display this weekend when the British Prime Minister described Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan leader, dramatically ousted by U.S. forces acting under Trump, as quote unquote, in quotations, an illegitimate president, with only a passing reference to Starmer's own backing of international law. Continuing on, it says here that Starmer added on Monday the global rules are very important. And it says, but stressed that if it's for the U.S. to set out its justifications and for the actions that it's taken on Trump's repeated threats to annex Greenland, Starmer has managed to be more robust response while still avoiding a direct criticizing the U.S. president. So essentially, he's basically caught within a sticky situation because you don't want, you know. As a matter of fact, this precept just came into my mind as I as I was reading this. Let me just get it real quick. Let me just get this 1 second. This is Proverbs chapter 27 verse 5. And it says open rebuke is better than secret love, right? So here it is, you have Starmer in this situation. He is not able to properly rebuke the US president for his actions, right? So basically what you have right now is a going and a flying off the handle of the US's actions, right? And this is not even like the first time this has happened. This has happened many times before. So the US essentially has a track record, or has fruits or works, you can say, of these deeds being crossed, these, crossing international, different boundary lines, because they, according to the UN and their when it comes to international law and proper policy, the U.S. is kind of given essentially like not even a slap on the wrist, but basically it's a nation that is not a nation. I'm sorry. The U.S. is essentially like a nation that dwells without care because there are no consequences for these actions that they take and they partake in, right? So here it is, he's in a certain kind of situation where, okay, I can't, properly criticize the actions of the U.S. because there's probably a lot more, I don't want to say control, but there's more of a that type of relationship where the British, they're probably benefiting from being in a strong partnership towards the U.S. But the U.S. is essentially like it's basically behaving as a woman that kind of goes unchecked, or like a child that constantly is unchecked for so long, right? And what happens is that child starts to become very headstrong, right? And the scriptures talk about that, right? So um let me go to, as a matter of fact, let me read this and then I'll go to Jeremiah. So here it says, ask if he stands with the European and NATO ally Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen and her demand that Trump stop talking about control of the territory. I stand with her, and she's right about the future of Greenland. So this is a quote from the prime minister, right? So there is a bit of a rift between. You start to see. I'm reading these things to show you the rift between the U.S. and these EU nations, right? There's a rift between the whore, which is America, and those different horns, right? That she rides upon, that those beast nations, right? So there's essentially a there is division, right? Division. It's no longer some, they're not in unity as much as they like to say, oh yes, we're United Nations and so on and so forth. That's not the case at all. The Lord is bringing a sentiment of division, and you're starting to see that trickle down more and more with the actions of the US, violating certain international policies and international laws, right? I'm talking about the laws and the international laws of this world, and the way that the mindset of a lot of these different leaders of these other nations, whether they be in the NATO and EU, right? So here, continuing on, it says one Labor PM elected in 2024 granted anonymity to speak candidly said on the latest U.S. intervention, said should give a kick up the ass. And it says when it comes to recognizing Trump's real priorities on the international stage, right? So this is his policies, and this is the way he actually goes towards things, right? So let me go, because I was speaking about children, and I wanted to get this point real quick in Jeremiah, right, to describe that that distaste that Britain kind of has for America, right? And this is not like the first time this has actually happened. This has happened, many times before. And this is Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 12, and it says, "And your mother shall be sore confounded. She that bare you shall be ashamed. Behold, the hindermost parts of the nations, excuse me, shall be as a wilderness and a dry land and as a desert." So the mother, within this particular context here, refers to Britain. America broke off, as its own, and they decided, okay, we don't want the leadership of the British, and we want to go across the Atlantic and establish our own nation, right? So America was essentially established back in 1776, right? And so America has broken off. So that's why America is used in this context, here, right? But I wanted to go back more and dive a little bit more into this relationship between, mother and child, right? Because, as mothers, oh, I don't want to say like, I am one, but I'm just saying like, parents, when your child is trained up properly, you know, they become, I don't want to say, you start to brag and kind of boast in them, right? This is my, especially mothers, right? They have a certain kind of sentiment when their children are raised properly. They boast in how well groomed and how well behaved their children are. But in this case, America is like that child is kind of like, yo, man, there's a certain level of distaste and there's a certain level of like, yo, you're doing too much. You're not rebuked enough. You're not corrected enough. So essentially, it starts to become a very headstrong child that's just dwelling carelessly without understanding the importance of repercussions. And those repercussions are going to be strongly dire, right? So, continuing on here, it says, um, give me one second. This is verse 13 in Jeremiah 50, and it says, because the wrath of the Lord, it shall not be inhabited, it should be wholly desolate. Every one that goeth by Babylon shall be astonished and hiss at her plagues. Right? So part of the judgment upon America, is that nuclear fire. Now, when you go back into the ancient times when you had children that were very, very stubborn, what you would do is, they were gluttons or drunkards and whatever. This is more dealing with like stubborn sons, right? So back in those days, when you had children like that, you would have them brought to the elders, and you explain to them, okay, this child, this son, he won't hearken unto the voice of the father or the mother, right? They're stubborn, they're glutton, they're drunkard, they're lazy, whatever it is. Now, what was the repercussions for children like that, right? Those children were stoned with stones, right? That they die, right? So essentially, what that did, it served as, when children behave that way, there was a repercussions for their actions in terms of, okay, this is the result thereof of what's going to happen when you continue to behave like this and you don't hearken unto the voice of your father and your mother, right? So I'm saying this all to say, going back to the point, you know America is essentially that child that hasn't been properly corrected, and the judgment is going to be so gruesome, where their own allies are even going to turn on them. So instead of actual stones, it's going to be actual nuclear warheads and missiles, right? So it shows you, um, America basically is constantly going forth, performing these different actions. It's just basically a woman that just dwells without care, without actually thinking about the consequences of what happens when you cross these lines, right? So, um, let me go to Sirach. One second. Sorry, my laptop's just a little bit slow. Just bear with me on this. Okay, so this is Sirach chapter 30, verse 8. And it says, a horse not broken becometh headstrong, and a child left to himself become willful. Conquer thy child, he shall make thee afraid. Play with him, and he will bring thee to heaviness. Laugh not with him, lest thou have sorrow. Just give me one second. Where was I? Verse 10. It says, "Laugh not with him, lest thou have sorrow with him, and lest thou gnash thy teeth in the end." Right? So there's just a way to actually properly raise children, right? And America breaking off, I'm kind of speaking about children here, but also extending the parabolic sense of how Britain is seen as that mother being spoken of in Jeremiah 50, and how that child, and America is functioning as that child that's not essentially is becoming extremely willful, that doesn't actually care and consider its follies. It doesn't actually look back and understand, okay, this is what you've done and this is the repercussions thereof. It's seen as it's just, think of like when you watch a lot of these videos and the children are in public with their parents, and they basically just they start throwing tantrums. They knock a bunch of the groceries onto like they're in the grocery store, for example. They just knock a bunch of the groceries on the ground. They're just creating a sense of havoc. I'm saying this all to say that America represents that child that goes into the grocery store, or they're in that playpen, or they're in some type of environment where they're just creating a scene of destruction, and they're just leading destruction here and there. And then the other children are like, oh goodness, and the other parents are like, oh goodness, like this is what's going on, eh? That child is looked as, as a problem, right? They're not looked as a child that's being well boasted in, or for example, or well revered, or your child is so behaved. America is not that type of character. It's a child that's unwillful. It's just willful. It's just misbehaves, right? And the other nations are kind of looking at America, and they're having a very strong distaste for America. So it's fueling other sentiments and prophecies. Another good example was, I was reading recently about the invasion in Grenada, and when brothers who go into it, it's the actions within that administration. So that took place within 1983. So basically, just a short synopsis. The U.S., they go into Grenada, and then they eventually they install their own, make sure this person is adhering to democracy, and they basically put a stop to the essentially the revolution, right? They took the Israelites that were ruling, because they were kind of more leaning towards more Marxist views, more communist views, because at that time, Grenada had very strong relationships with Cuba, right? And this was during back in the time where there's this Cold War era, this ideological warfare between the Soviet Union and Russia. I'm sorry, between the Soviet Union and the US, right? So, the same sentiment applied back then, because the prime minister at that time, Margaret Thatcher, she had condemned the behaviors of America. So you start to see more and more time again why that mother. I'll read it again. This is Jeremiah 50:12, and it says, "Your mother shall be sore confounded, and she shall bear you, shall be ashamed." So that ashamed, that shame, that attitude that Britain has for America, it's a very strong distaste. They don't like the way you behave, because it's kind of like, okay, the child is an extension of the mother, of the parents, right? So I'm saying this to say, like, I'm speaking parabolically between, mother and children, but to start to see the understanding of how a lot of these other nations, especially Britain in this particular case, they have a strong distaste for America, right? So let me get Revelation 1 second. Actually, I'll go back here. This is Revelation 17 and 16, and it says, "And 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, they shall hate the whore." Right? So there's a strong dislike for the way that they behave, and this is not essentially the first time. You had other situations with other past presidents, where they've gone in, during the years of we had Bush Jr., Iraq, right? You had Libya, and you create a lot more enemies than friends. And it says, continuing on, and it says, "And it shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire." So that is the judgment of what happens to that child, like I'm referring to, where the child actually is being properly disciplined, right? So that judgment right here is speaking of that nuclear missiles, which they shall shoot upon America and make her desolate, right? So they'll be completely flattened and taken over by destruction, because this is what happens, when you have a judgment where essentially it's just, it just continues to accumulate, right? So that is the judgment for America, right? Even their own allies, their own nations that they're very close with right now are going to turn on them. So let me get Sirach. Let me go back to Sirach here. This is Sirach chapter 12, verse 8, and it says, "A friend cannot be known in prosperity, and an enemy cannot be hidden in adversity." And that's going to be a time of adversity for America, because their enemies, they're going to realize that they're going to have a lot more enemies. And it's a saying in the world that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So a lot of these other nations are going to have a certain common sentiment. They're going to be in that sentiment of like, okay, oh, America's your enemy. Oh, America's my enemy too. So they essentially become friends, right? You might have, other alliances that actually even join up and actually become a hedge of protection, being spearheaded by Russia, pursuant to Ezekiel 38, right? So all these other, BRICS nations coupled with Libya, and you have Persia, and you have what's the other one? Ethiopia, so on and so forth. All these other nations, they have a very strong dislike for Americans because they've been doing the same thing over and over and over again, right? So, anyways, I just thought I would touch on this in regards to the sentiments of how a lot of these other nations, just specifically Britain, has a strong distaste in regards to America, right? So I just thought I would discuss this real quick, but Lord's will, this lesson was edifying. I'd just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Hawashai. Until next time, I say Shalom.